He pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. Not a jam, not a misfire. Just silence. The most terrifying sound a combat soldier can hear. It was December 1944. The forests of the Ardennes were locked in what survivors would later call the worst winter Belgium had seen in 25 years. Snow buried the foxholes. Frostbite claimed toes before dawn. And somewhere in those frozen trees, German infantry was closing in. The soldier looked down at his weapon, the M3 submachine gun, the Army's newest, cheapest, most modern firearm. He tried the cocking handle again. It moved sluggishly, as if fighting through glue, because it was. The lubricant inside the receiver, thickened to near solid by the sub-zero cold, had turned the gun's internal mechanism into something closer to a paperweight than a weapon. He reached for a discarded Thompson he'd picked up 2 days earlier from a casualty. Ugly, heavy, old, but it fired. That moment, a soldier in the bloodiest battle in American military history, quietly setting aside the Army's newest weapon in favor of a design from World War I, tells you everything you need to know about what happened when the United States Army prioritized cost over conditions. This is the story of the M3 grease gun, the Ardennes offensive, and what happens when a weapon built for an accountant's ledger meets a battlefield built for survival. To understand what went wrong in the forests of Belgium, you have to go back to a problem that had nothing to do with combat. It had to do with money. By 1941, the United States Army was staring at a terrifying arithmetic problem. The nation was mobilizing for a war on 2 oceans simultaneously, and the math simply didn't work. Factories were running at capacity, steel was scarce. Skilled machinists were being drafted faster than they could be replaced. And the Army's standard submachine gun, the Thompson, the famous Tommy gun, was costing the government a fortune. In 1939, a single M1928A1 Thompson submachine gun cost the U.S. government more than $200. That was more than 4 times a soldier's monthly pay. Even after years of cost-cutting and design simplification, the most streamlined Thompson variant, the M1A1, still ran about $45 per unit. The Army needed weapons by the hundreds of thousands, and the Thompson's price tag made that nearly impossible. The solution, officials decided, was to look at what the enemy was doing. Germany's MP40 and Britain's Sten gun had been manufactured using stamped sheet metal and welded components, techniques borrowed directly from the automotive industry. They were ugly, they were crude, but they were cheap and they could be made fast. In early 1942, the U.S. Army Ordnance Department issued a challenge. Design a submachine gun that could be produced at a fraction of the Thompson's cost, using the same mass production techniques that built American cars. A designer named George Hyde, working out of General Motors' Inland Division, took on the task. His partner, Chief Engineer Frederick Sampson, was responsible for making sure whatever Hyde designed could actually be produced at scale. Together, they worked at a speed that would be nearly unimaginable today. 5 prototype models were submitted to Aberdeen Proving Ground in November 1942. By December 24th of that same year, less than 2 months after the prototypes arrived, the Ordnance Department formally recommended adoption of Hyde's design as the U.S. submachine gun, caliber 45 M3. The contract to build this new weapon went not to a gun manufacturer, but to the guide lamp division of General Motors in Anderson, Indiana, a factory that normally made automobile headlights. Guide Lamp had just finished producing 1 million FP45 Liberator pistols, the crude single-shot weapons the OSS airdropped to resistance fighters across occupied Europe. Now they were turning their stamping presses and welding torches toward something slightly more sophisticated. The final per-unit cost came to $20.94. That was less than half the price of the simplified M1A1 Thompson. The arithmetic worked, and Washington was pleased. Soldiers, when they first laid eyes on the M3, were significantly less enthusiastic. The weapon looked like what it was, a product of the factory floor. 2 stamped steel halves welded together to form a cylindrical receiver, a telescoping wire stock, a cocking handle mounted on the right side of the receiver, a 9-part assembly of pressed metal. It had no wooden furniture, no graceful curves, no sense of craftsmanship whatsoever. Soldiers almost immediately started calling it the grease gun because it looked exactly like the tool a mechanic uses to force lubricant into a car's chassis. One soldier with the 101st Airborne Division, Don Burgett, called it flatly a piece of junk. In the 82nd Airborne, most troopers, if given a choice, quietly held onto their Thompson. Veterans who had trained with the finely machined Tommy gun felt that the grease gun insulted them. It looked like something built to be thrown away, which, in a sense, it was. The Army's original concept classified the M3 as a disposable weapon. Once it became unserviceable, the soldier would simply discard it and requisition a replacement. Ordnance officers saw this as elegant logistics. Infantrymen deep in enemy territory, a long way from any supply depot, saw it rather differently. But the M3 had a more immediate problem, one that appeared before the weapon ever reached a battlefield. As early as February 1944, training camps across the United States began filing reports. The cocking handle and the 9-part assembly of pressed metal mounted on the right side of the receiver was breaking. Soldiers who dropped the M3 on its right side discovered that the fragile stamped metal handle would shear off on impact. Without the cocking handle, the bolt could not be drawn to the rear. Without a drawn bolt, the weapon could not fire. It was as simple and as catastrophic as that. An investigation confirmed what anyone who handled the weapon already suspected. The cocking handle had been made from low-grade steel with improper heat treatment. The same cost-cutting that made the M3 an accountant's dream made it a soldier's problem. Ordnance engineers made adjustments to later production runs. A new design, the M3E1, was already in development by April 1944, featuring the complete elimination of the cocking handle in favor of a simple slot machined directly into the bolt. A soldier could retract it with a single finger. That improved variant would eventually become the M3A1 and be formally adopted on December 21, 1944. But December 21, 1944 was 5 days after the Battle of the Bulge had already begun. The soldiers who walked into the Ardennes that winter were carrying the original M3, with its fragile cocking handle, its known deficiencies, and its total lack of available repair parts. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the temperature at Bastogne, Belgium, was 14 degrees Fahrenheit. It would not get warmer for weeks. Hitler had chosen the Ardennes deliberately. It was a quiet sector. 80,000 American soldiers spread thin along a line through Belgium and Luxembourg, guarding a front that military planners on both sides considered unlikely territory for a major offensive. The terrain was too rough, the roads too narrow, the forests too dense, which was precisely why Hitler chose it. At 5:30 in the morning, the German army threw 13 infantry divisions and 8 armored divisions at those American positions. Artillery barrages opened in the darkness. Soldiers who had been sleeping in farmhouses and foxholes were suddenly fighting for their lives in the snow, many of them unable to call for air support because the fog was so thick that Allied aircraft were grounded. The surprise was nearly total. American units along the northern shoulder of the attack were overrun within hours. The 106th Infantry Division, newly arrived and still learning the sector, was surrounded and largely destroyed. Entire regiments surrendered. The situation was not merely serious. It was desperate. And into this desperation, American soldiers carried their weapons, some of them the newest, most modern equipment the Army had issued. Cold is not simply uncomfortable, cold is a mechanical problem. Every moving part inside a firearm operates on tolerances, precise measurements of how much space exists between components. Lubricants fill the gaps, reduce friction, and allow metal to move against metal without seizing. But lubricants are temperature dependent. The oils and greases used in 1944 were not formulated for Arctic conditions. As temperatures dropped into the single digits, then below zero, those lubricants changed their character. They didn't freeze solid, but they thickened. They turned viscous. They became sluggish. And mechanisms that operated smoothly at room temperature began to labor, to slow, and sometimes to stop altogether. This was not unique to the M3. German rifles and machine guns had suffered the same fate years earlier in Russia. Soldiers on the Eastern Front had learned, through terrible experience, to strip their weapons entirely of lubricant in extreme cold, running them dry, accepting increased wear in exchange for reliable function. Some used captured cooking oil. Some used nothing at all. American soldiers in the Ardennes were receiving that same education in the hardest possible classroom. For M3 users, the cold compounded problems that already existed. The cocking handle assembly, already known to be fragile, became more vulnerable as metal contracted in the cold, and tolerances shifted. Soldiers operating in foxholes with numb fingers were more likely to drop their weapons, more likely to strike the receiver on a hard surface, more likely to shear that fragile handle off at the worst possible moment. And when the handle broke, in a weapon that had been classified as disposable, in a theater where spare parts for the M3 had simply not been stocked, the soldier holding it had a problem with no official solution. Ordnance units improvised. Mechanics with the Third Army developed a field modification, cutting a slot into the top of the receiver and fashioning a crude charging handle directly from whatever metal was at hand, welding it directly to the bolt. It worked. It kept guns firing. 5 of these field-modified M3s survived the war and can be seen today in the collection of the National Military History Museum in Diekirch, Luxembourg. Mute evidence of what soldiers and mechanics figured out under fire, because the production system had sent them a weapon with a known defect and no repair infrastructure. Others turned to a more direct solution. They went looking for Thompsons. The Thompson M1A1 was heavier by several pounds, and it cost more than twice what an M3 cost the government. But it had been designed by men who thought carefully about how a weapon would actually be used, and its internal geometry, a heavier bolt with more forceful return springs, machined to tighter tolerances but with a more robust design philosophy, gave it better tolerance for the cold. Veterans who had fought in North Africa, in Sicily, in Italy, in Normandy trusted it. And in the Ardennes, trust was a form of survival. The psychological dimension of this shift should not be underestimated. A soldier who does not trust his weapon has a burden that goes beyond the physical. Every time he enters a building, rounds a corner, or advances across an open field, he carries not only the weight of his equipment, but the uncertainty of whether it will function when he pulls the trigger. That uncertainty is corrosive. It erodes the confidence that combat effectiveness requires. Reports from unit commanders in the Ardennes noted that morale among troops issued the M3 was complicated by the weapon's reputation. Men who had heard about, or personally experienced, the cocking handle failure were reluctant to rely on the grease gun under stress. Some simply did not. They used whatever else they could find. A Battle Experiences circular issued by Headquarters, U.S. Army European Theater of Operations, on March 16, 1945, offered a telling piece of improvised guidance. Soldiers were instructed to cut an M1 rifle operating rod spring into 4 equal sections, then use 2 of those sections to replace the guide rod springs inside a grease gun. This was not elegant engineering. It was a field patch, the kind of thing that appears in official documents only when the problem it addresses has become widespread enough that someone in authority has finally decided to acknowledge it. Another circular from a sergeant with the unit recorded his men's complaint about the M3's magazine release being too loose. When the weapon was slung over a shoulder, the friction could depress the release and drop the magazine. His soldier's solution: take a ball-peen hammer and bend the release slightly to stiffen it. It worked. It was also the kind of modification no soldier should ever have to perform on a weapon issued by the most powerful industrial nation on Earth. The battleground on through Christmas, through the New Year, into January. Patton's Third Army fought its way north to relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne. The northern shoulder held. Slowly, painfully, the German tide was pushed back. By January 25, 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was officially over. It had been the bloodiest engagement in American military history. Roughly 75,000 American casualties in 40 days. The Army had learned things it hadn't expected to learn. Some of those lessons were about the M3 specifically. The adoption of the M3A1, formalized on December 21, 1944, precisely as soldiers were fighting and dying in the Ardennes, addressed the most glaring mechanical failure. The fragile cocking handle was gone. In its place, a simple recess machined into the bolt. To charge the weapon, a soldier inserted his finger and pulled. It was so simple it seemed almost obvious. The ejection port was enlarged. The rear sight was strengthened. The dust cover was redesigned to reduce the risk of accidental discharge when the weapon was dropped. The wire stock was modified to serve as a barrel wrench and a magazine loading tool. These were not radical innovations. They were the corrections that experienced soldiers and ordnance engineers had been requesting, some of them since before D-Day. The question of why they hadn't been incorporated into the original design is one that doesn't have a comfortable answer. The honest answer involves schedules, contracts, production commitments, and the institutional reluctance of any large bureaucracy to halt a successful production line in order to fix a problem that hasn't yet killed enough people to demand action. The broader lesson about lubricants, about cold weather performance, about the relationship between temperature and mechanical reliability took longer to absorb. Arctic-grade synthetic lubricants were not yet available in 1944. Petroleum-based oils were the standard across all armies. But the Ardennes made it undeniable that cold weather testing had to be part of any weapons development process, not an afterthought. In the decades that followed, U.S. Army doctrine evolved to address this. Testing procedures at Aberdeen Proving Ground and other facilities incorporated extreme temperature ranges as standard requirements. The lesson of the Ardennes, that a weapon must function not in the conditions you expect but in the conditions you actually encounter, became foundational. The M3A1 itself went on to serve longer than almost any weapon in American military history. Tank crews carried it through Korea. It was the standard submachine gun for American tankmen through the Cold War, issued with M48 Pattons and M60 main battle tanks. In 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, American tanks rolled into Kuwait and Iraq with M3A1s stowed inside the turrets, a weapon designed in 1942, still in service nearly 50 years later. Final retirement came in 1992 when the M4 carbine took its place. 50 years of service. Not bad for a weapon that looked like a mechanic's tool, but that long legacy cannot fully obscure what happened in December 1944. A weapon was rushed into production with known deficiencies. It was declared disposable by officials who would never carry one. It was issued without an adequate supply of spare parts, without cold weather lubricant guidance, without the infrastructure needed to maintain it in the field. And then it was given to young men who walked into the coldest winter Belgium had seen. In a generation, in the middle of the most desperate battle America would fight in World War II. Some of those men pulled the trigger and heard silence. There's a tendency, when we look back at the weapons of the Second World War, to focus on the iconic. The M1 Garand, the Thompson, the Browning. These are the tools of legend, the ones that appear in the films and the photographs and the carefully curated museum displays. The M3 grease gun is rarely cast as a hero, but the story of the M3 in the Ardennes is worth knowing precisely because it isn't a hero story. It's something more complicated and more honest than that. It's the story of what happens when a nation at war makes decisions about weapons the way it makes decisions about factory output, optimizing for cost, for speed, for throughput, and then sends those decisions into the field in the hands of men who have to live with the consequences. Those men adapted. They improvised. They bent magazine releases with ball-peen hammers. They cut springs from M1 rifles. They found old Thompsons in the snow and they trusted those instead. They survived not because the system served them well, but because they were resourceful enough to compensate for the system's failures. That is, in the end, the story of the American soldier in the Second World War. Not invincible, not perfectly equipped, not served by a flawless machine, but adaptable, determined, willing to solve the problem in front of them with whatever they had. The grease gun was ugly. It was flawed. In the cold of the Ardennes, it sometimes let men down at the worst possible moment. But in the hands of soldiers who understood its limits and worked around them, it was also something simpler and more essential. It was enough. The men who carried it, who bent it, modified it, jury-rigged it, and occasionally set it aside for something older and more reliable, went on to win the battle anyway. They did what soldiers always do with imperfect equipment and impossible circumstances. They figured it out. And that may be the most important military lesson of the Ardennes, that the weapon matters, but the man holding it matters more. Rest well, gentlemen. You earned it. If this story meant something to you, there's a simple way to make sure more people hear it. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment. Tell us what you know about the Battle of the Bulge, about the weapons that were carried there, about the men in your own family who were part of it. Share this video with someone who cares about history told the right way, and ring that bell, because the next story is already waiting.